That's Rod Serling introducing an episode of The Twilight Zone more than half a century ago. Starting tomorrow, the show is back in an all-new series on CBS All Access.
There's something deeply unsettling about a story that gets erased, not destroyed, not lost by accident, but quietly removed, pulled off shelves, skipped over in catalogs, left out of marathons, treated as though it never existed at all. That kind of silence has weight. It tells you that something inside that story was considered too dangerous to revisit, too complicated to explain, or too honest to survive the politics of the moment. That is exactly what happened in one of the most powerful episodes ever produced by The Twilight Zone. For more than half a century, it was unavailable. Fans who hunted for it came up empty. Archivists noted its absence. And for decades, most casual viewers simply had no idea it had ever existed. The episode was called The Encounter, and it aired exactly once on the night of May 1st, 1964. Then it vanished. But before we can understand why it disappeared, we have to understand what the Twilight Zone was, what it was trying to do, and why Rod Serling's vision was so threatening to the people who controlled American television in the first place. The Twilight Zone premiered on CBS on October 2nd, 1959. It was, by any measure, unlike anything else on television at the time. American TV in the late 1950s was dominated by comfortable domestic comedies, westerns that confirmed simple moral hierarchies, and game shows that rewarded cheerful conformity. The Twilight Zone was none of those things. It had no recurring cast, no ongoing narrative. Every week was a new beginning, a new world, a new set of characters descending into something strange and often deeply disturbing. What connected the episodes was not plot, but philosophy, and that philosophy belonged almost entirely to one man. Rod Serling was a World War II veteran who had served in the Pacific Theater and carried the weight of that experience for the rest of his life. He had witnessed enough real horror to be uninterested in pretending the world was tidy or just. When he came back from the war and eventually found his way into television writing, he was immediately frustrated by the censorship system that governed American broadcast media. Sponsors held enormous power over content. Network executives were terrified of controversy, and Southern television affiliates, who were crucial to national ratings, made sure that any story touching on race, civil rights, or social inequality was watered down into meaninglessness before it reached the public. Serling discovered this the hard way in 1956, when he wrote a teleplay based loosely on the murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black boy from Chicago who was brutally killed in Mississippi while visiting relatives. By the time the network and sponsors were finished with it, every element that gave the story meaning had been stripped away. The victim was changed from a black American child to a nameless foreign man. The setting was relocated out of the South. The racial dimension, which was the entire point of the story, had been surgically removed. Serling was devastated. He described the experience as one of the most demoralizing of his career. But instead of giving up, he found a different strategy. If a network censor would not let him set a story about injustice in Alabama, he would set it on a distant planet. If a sponsor would not allow a drama about the dangers of unchecked government power, he would frame it as a science fiction parable. The Twilight Zone became his workaround, his method of smuggling difficult truths past the gatekeepers who would otherwise silence them. He used the genre conventions of speculative fiction, the alien planets, the time machines, the parallel dimensions. As camouflage for ideas that would have been rejected, it presented directly that IT worked for a while. Episodes like The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, in which suburban neighbors turn on each other after supposed alien invasion, were really about McCarthyism, about the hysteria of the Red Scare, about how quickly ordinary people could be manipulated into suspecting their own community. Eye of the Beholder, a story about a woman desperate to undergo surgery to look normal, was a sharp critique of conformity and arbitrary beauty standards. He's Alive, one of the most overtly political episodes the series ever produced, depicted the ghost of Adolf Hitler guiding a neo-Nazi agitator in contemporary America, making an explicit argument about how fascism survives through ordinary human weakness. These episodes push boundaries. Some provoke complaints. But most of them survived because they were packaged in enough genre distance that the censors did not feel directly challenged. The monster was an alien, not a neighbor. The villain was from another dimension, not from the local church or the city government. Serling understood that metaphor was a kind of armor, and he wore it constantly. But by the fifth and final season of The Twilight Zone, the armor was wearing thin. The Encounter was written by Martin M. Goldsmith and directed by Robert Butler. It starred Neville Brand as a World War II veteran named Arthur Fenton and a young George Takei, years before his iconic role as Hikaru Sulu in Star Trek, as a Japanese-American man named Arthur Takamori. The entire episode takes place in a single attic. There is no alien invasion, no time travel, no supernatural twist in the conventional sense. Just two men in a room, surrounded by the remnants of a war neither of them can leave behind. The story opens with Fenton sorting through boxes in his attic when he encounters Takamori, who has arrived looking for odd jobs. Fenton is gruff, casually racist in the way that men of his generation were often permitted to be on screen, and clearly haunted. On a shelf in the attic sits a Japanese samurai sword, a trophy he brought back from the Pacific after killing its owner. It is the first detail you notice, and it should be. That sword is the center of gravity around which everything else orbits. What begins as a tense but manageable conversation between two strangers gradually reveals itself to be something far more psychologically dangerous. Fenton begins talking about the war, about what he saw, about what he did. The tone and nostalgia curdles quickly into something uglier. He is not processing his past. He is still living in it. He drinks. He reminisces in a way that sometimes covers confession. And the more he talks, the clearer it becomes that his participation in the war was not entirely heroic. The soldier he killed for that sword, it emerges, may have been unarmed. It may have been a killing that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with hatred. Meanwhile, Takamori grows increasingly disturbed by the sword itself, drawn to it in a way he cannot fully explain. And then, under the mounting pressure of Fenton's paranoia and the strange energy in the room, it reveals something about his own history that shifts the entire dynamic of the episode. He tells Fenton that his father, a Japanese-American man living in the United States, had been a spy for Imperial Japan and had provided intelligence that contributed to the attack on Pearl Harbor. This revelation hit 1964 audiences like a detonation. Even today it reads as a calculated provocation, because in the context of what Japanese Americans had actually experienced during World War II, that admission was not just dramatic, it was incendiary. Over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, the vast majority of them American citizens, had been forcibly removed from their homes, stripped of their property, and imprisoned in internment camps following Pearl Harbor. There was never any substantial evidence of mass espionage or disloyalty among Japanese American communities. The internment was driven by racial fear and wartime hysteria, not by legitimate security intelligence. The Supreme Court upheld in the notorious 1944 Korematsu versus United States decision, a ruling that remained in place as dark law until it was explicitly overruled in 2018. Tosho, a Japanese-American character, confirming on television that his father had been a spy was, in the eyes of many viewers and advocacy groups, to retroactively justify everything that had been done to those 120,000 people. It felt like a betrayal of historical truth. It felt like an insult delivered at the very moment that Japanese-American communities were still trying to recover, still denied the acknowledgement that what had been done to them was wrong. That is why CBS was flooded with complaints, and that is why the episode was pulled. But here's what the critics who demanded its removal missed, and what makes the encounter worth watching even now. The episode is not endorsing Fenton's worldview. It is not suggesting that the internment was justified. What it is doing is something far more uncomfortable. It is forcing both characters into a space where neither one can claim clean hands, where the violence of war does not resolve into triumph and tragedy, but instead spreads like contamination across generations, warping the minds of the people who survived it and the children of those people too. Fenton is not presented as a hero. He is presented as a man eaten alive by what he did, hiding it under a performance of patriotism. His racism is not validated. It is dissected, and Takamori's confession, whatever its literal truth, reads less as historical fact and more as the voice of a man so thoroughly dehumanized by a country that locked him up as a child that he has internalized the accusation, made his own, wrapped himself in the guilt the country assigned him even though he did nothing to earn it. The sword, Serling's great metaphor in this episode. does not belong to either man. It belongs to the logic of war itself. It is a thing that passes violence from one hand to the next, generation to generation, and will not let go of the people who touched it. George Takei, who played Takamori, had personal experience that gave performance unbearable weight. He was 5 years old when armed soldiers came to his family's home in Los Angeles and escorted them to a relocation center in Arkansas. He grew up in the camps. He understood, from lived experience, what it meant to be treated as an enemy in the country where you were born. His presence in this episode was not just casting. It was testimony. How does an episode of a celebrated television series get buried for 55 years? The answer is not as dramatic as Conspiracy, but it is just as revealing about how cultural memory works. When the Twilight Zone ended its original run in 1964, it entered the syndication market. Local television stations across the country licensed a right to rebroadcast episodes during off-peak hours, and the show became a fixture of late-night and weekend programming for decades. But the syndication package assembled by CBS was curated. It was not a neutral archive. Episodes were selected based on their commercial viability, their legal cleanliness, and their perceived ability to air without generating complaints from local stations or advertisers. The Encounter failed on all 3 counts. The complaints from Asian American advocacy groups had put CBS in a legally and reputationally uncomfortable position. The episode touched a wound that was still very much open. The formal government apology for Japanese American internment would not come until 1988, nearly a quarter century after the episode aired. In 1964, acknowledging that wound required confronting the actions of the United States government, the real ones, not the fictional ones. The Encounter did not let the government off the hook. It showed 2 men destroyed by a war that the country had not finished reckoning with. That was too much. And so the episode was simply excluded. When home video releases of the series began appearing in the 1980s, The Encounter was not included. When cable channels ran marathon broadcasts of The Twilight Zone, the episode was skipped. It did not show up on early digital releases. It was not part of the DVD box sets that were released in the early 2000s when the show enjoyed a major nostalgic revival. For most of the people who grew up watching the show on late-night television, The Encounter might as well not have existed. This is how cultural erasure works in the real world. It rarely involves fires and destroyed archives. It usually involves exclusion from catalogs, omission from anniversary packages, and the gradual forgetting that comes when a story is simply never repeated. Books go out of print. Films are not preserved. Television episodes are left out of syndication deals. And within a generation, the thing that was once controversial has become the thing that was never known. Rod Serling himself fought this kind of erasure throughout his career. He was acutely aware of how the broadcast industry could neutralize a critical voice not by attacking it directly, but by slowly narrowing the space available to it. He once described television as the most powerful medium ever invented for saying nothing. He meant it as a criticism of what the industry chose to do with that power. The Twilight Zone was his attempt to say something, and even then, the industry found ways to limit how much could be heard. Other episodes experienced similar fates for different reasons. Miniature, starring the young Robert Duvall, was pulled from syndication because of a copyright dispute with the estate of the original author. The episode, a quietly devastating story about a lonely man who retreats into a fantasy world, remained invisible for decades due to unresolved licensing issues that had nothing to do with its content. A short drink from a certain fountain was removed over allegations that the screenplay resembled a previously existing unpublished script, creating legal exposure that CBS chose to avoid by keeping the episode out of circulation rather than fighting for it. Sounds and Silences disappeared after a lawsuit from a private individual who claimed the episode was based on his life without consent. And an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, an Academy Award-winning French short film that CBS had purchased the rights to air as a special episode, was only ever licensed for a single broadcast. Each of these cases is different in its particulars, but they share a common thread: the decision to suppress rather than defend. In each instance, the broadcast industry chose the path of least resistance, which meant removing the episodes from circulation and hoping the questions they raised would go away. They usually did, until they didn't. In 2016, something changed. The Sci-Fi Channel, which had acquired the rights to air a comprehensive New Year's Eve Twilight Zone marathon, announced that the encounter would be included in the broadcast for the first time since an original 1964 airing. No edits, no framing commentary inserted to guide the audience's reaction. Just the episode itself, dropped into the lineup after more than half a century of silence. The response was striking. Longtime fans who had heard about the episode only through rumors and secondhand accounts finally saw it for themselves. Younger viewers who had never heard of it encountered something that felt genuinely raw and immediate, not like a television artifact from 60 years ago, but like a story that could have been written last week. Critics who revisited it wrote about its psychological intensity, its moral complexity, and the way it refused to offer either character an easy exit or the audience a comfortable position. George Takei, who had gone on to become one of the most prominent voices in American public life on issues of civil rights and historical memory, spoke more openly about the episode in the years following its return. He acknowledged its contradictions, the way it had been used to represent real anxieties about race and national loyalty in ways that were not always fair or accurate. But he also spoke about why stories that make people uncomfortable are precisely the ones that need to be told and preserved. Erasing an episode because it raised the wrong questions, he suggested, was not the same as answering those questions. It was just postponing the reckoning. That he was right. And the reckoning, when it finally came, was not limited to one television episode. The early 2020s brought a significant, painful increase in anti-Asian violence across the United States. Following the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, and amplified by political rhetoric that attached national blame to Asian identity, Asian American communities experienced a wave of harassment and assault that deeply echoed the dynamics of earlier periods in American history. Elderly Asian Americans were attacked on public transportation. Businesses were vandalized. People who had been born in the United States, who had lived their entire lives as Americans, were told to go back where they came from. The assumption of foreignness, of otherness, of being a potential enemy inside a trusted community, had not disappeared. It had only been dormant in that context. The encounter did not feel like history. It felt like documentation. What Serling understood when he made space for this episode in the final season of his series was something that still resists easy articulation, that the damage done by war and by the racial politics that war is so often exposed does not end when the war ends. It does not heal when a peace treaty is signed or when a formal apology is issued. It continues operating in the bodies and minds of the people who survived it, and in the children of those people, and in the cultural assumptions that outlast any single generation's willingness to confront them. The attic in the encounter is not just a setting. It is a symbol for the national unconscious, full of things we brought home and never dealt with, weapons we keep on shelves and pretend are trophies, guilt we dress up as pride. The episode also challenges something that American popular culture has consistently struggled to do honestly. It refuses to treat the veteran as an uncomplicated hero. Fenton did not come home from the Pacific transformed by righteous sacrifice. He came home damaged, carrying a stolen weapon and the memory of something he is not prepared to confess. The military service is real. So is the darkness that came with it. Holding both of those truths at the same time, without resolving one into the other, is more honest than almost anything else American television produced in that era. And Takamori is not a simple victim. He is a man shaped by an injustice that was done to him before he was old enough to understand it, and the way that injustice warped his sense of self, his relationship to his own history, and his capacity for peace is the psychological core of the episode. He is not there to make Fenton feel better about what he did. He is not there to confirm that America was right. He is there because the story demanded honesty, and honesty required showing the full weight of what the internment had cost the people who survived it. Rod Serling died in 1975 at the age of 50, worn down by decades of fighting the entertainment industry for the right to say something real. He never saw the formal apology for Japanese-American internment. He never saw the Korematsu decision overruled. He never saw the encounter return to public view. He left behind 156 episodes of a television series that still, more than 6 decades after its original run, feels more relevant than most of what is currently in production. The Twilight Zone has been revived multiple times. In 1985, CBS brought it back as an anthology series that ran for 3 seasons and included work from some of the best genre writers working at the time. In 2002, UPN attempted another revival that lasted only 1 season. In 2019, Jordan Peele took on the role of host and narrator for a CBS All-Access reboot, bringing his considerable talent for social horror, which he had demonstrated in Get Out and Us, to a new generation of Twilight Zone episodes. The reviews were genuinely mixed, but the series found an audience that recognized what Peele was attempting, to do for his era what Serling had done for his, to use speculative fiction as a mirror, to show people something familiar, and then twist it just enough to reveal the uncomfortable thing underneath. That tradition did not begin with Serling, and it will not end with Peele. The instinct to use story as a method of truth-telling, to say in fiction what cannot be said directly, is as old as storytelling itself. What changes is the mechanism of censorship. In Serling's era, it was network executives and sponsors. In the present era, it is algorithmic content flagging, platform community guidelines, and the shifting and often incoherent standards of what counts as harmful speech versus protected artistic expression. The technology is different,